Hello, and welcome to Political Science 102, Introduction to American Government and Politics. I'm Dr. Dino Bozonelos, and I'll be lecturing on Chapter 7 in Maroney and Kirsch's book, By the People Debating American Government, entitled Political Participation. Please make sure that when you're listening to this lecture, that you also have the PowerPoint for Chapter 7 available to follow along. I will frequently be referencing the PowerPoints as the semester progresses, especially when it comes to graphs. You can either print out PowerPoints, or for those of you who have Windows 7 or above, have a split screen with the PowerPoint available. It is my advice that you have the printed PowerPoints with notes from the lecture and the book on the PowerPoints before you take the quizzes. Many times students fare poorly on the quizzes as they are frantically looking for the answers without having read the book or try to answer the question simultaneously while watching the video. As these questions are randomized, this strategy won't work. So let's begin. This is on Chapter 7, Political Participation. And in this chapter, you will explore the paradox of America exhibiting both strong and weak political participation. We'll identify the benefits and drawbacks of what we call America's clickocracy, as political advocacy information are increasingly transferred online. And then we'll draw conclusions about whether there can be too much popular participation in a democratic nation like the United States. So it's interesting here that the authors, what they do is they start off this chapter on political participation by talking about how we participate. And in some ways, they argue we're kind of an unusually engaged people, while in other ways we look downright apathetic. So understanding why sort of requires a closer look at sort of how Americans participate. And so political scientists often categorize participation in three main ways. The first group of people are what we call passionates. These are the folks that follow politics very closely, are aware of the details of most leading issues of the day, often get directly involved. These are the people that we would say are the most deeply involved. This is only a small proportion of Americans that fit into this category, typically around 4 to 5% of the voting age population. The next group of people are what we call the scorekeepers. These are people that are generally aware of media headlines and typically follow a few topics with interest. And so you're probably looking at about 15 to 20% of Americans of voting age are what we call scorekeepers. Many of these scorekeepers often also politically identify themselves as independents, whereas the passionates will either be Republican or Democrat. And so the folks that you see holding the signs here, to both that were for, that wanted the Supreme Court to vote to keep the Affordable Care Act constitutional, and those against it, these are folks that are probably registered Republican and Democrat, or strongly identify Republican or Democrat. The last group are what we call the uninvolved. Members of this group, which comprises the vast majority of Americans, are not at all. They do not see politics as important to their daily lives, but focus on big issues sometimes. So they're not checked out entirely, but they also really don't care much about politics. And in fact, if you're watching this lecture and you happen to be one of those students that's an uninvolved, this most likely describes most Americans. So, however, at least 2/5 typically vote in presidential elections. And so they try to understand, why is it that a majority of Americans are uninvolved? And what they often find out is that many people just avoid politics because they often do not have the time and energy to get involved. If you're struggling to feed a family or keep a roof over your head, you're less likely to volunteer for a political campaign. Recently it's also been shown, another reason is that, recent immigrants, many Latinos, for example, have been voting at much lower rates than other groups, though those numbers are changing. So many recent immigrants, and about 13 to 15% of our population are recent immigrants, they're not as interested in participating in politics because they're too busy just trying to make it. And then there's the group called the slackers. The slackers are educated, relatively well-off residents who do not see government or policy issues as relevant to their lives. And the authors have been arguing that the number of slackers has been growing in recent decades. I guess a good question to ask is, can a democratic political system survive if a large swath of its population mostly ignores what is often referred to as the people's business? Or is it better for the misinformed to stay away from the voting booth or other means of registering their views? It's a good question. I'm not sure. And then also, does the government even want the public involved in its work? Here's what we do. What we do know is that high participation rates do make a democracy more robust. People obviously have more faith in the system when they're more involved because they feel like they're getting their voice heard. But it will slow things down. We're obviously less efficient the more people become involved. So then when we do get involved, what are the main avenues on how we get involved? There's three categories, and the first is that of electoral activities. The second is civic volunteerism, and the third is political voice. Now, in electoral activities, often what happens, excuse me, let me go down to my notes here. With electoral activities, if you voted in any recent U.S. election, you know that there's kind of a basic drill. First, you register to vote, which you can do now when you obtain your driver's license. Secondly, preferably after familiarizing yourself with the candidates, you show up on election day at your assigned polling place. And then next comes the act of voting itself. Now, if you look here in this top image right here, this is how most states vote. You paper and pencil, and it's, there's what we call a wall of secrecy. In other words, no one knows how you're voting. And so this idea is that you're voting independently. No one there is trying to influence or force you to vote in a certain way. Some states have embraced electronic voting. California actually used to have electronic voting, but there were a number of glitches in the system. Nothing that cost anybody any elections, but there were enough that there were some concerns that moved us to go back to paper and pen until this can be solved. Now, compared to other countries, the U.S. Compared to other countries, the U.S. actually votes a lot more frequently. In other words, if you look at a place like Australia, they probably vote once every 4 years. Great Britain once every 5 years. We vote at least every 2 years nationally, and then in between, we have a bunch of local and state elections. Americans, and especially Californians, you guys could be asked to vote maybe 2 to 3 times a year. And this develops what we call voter fatigue. The authors don't mention this, but voter fatigue is something that develops when people are just tired of voting all the time. And so this does affect what we call voter turnout. And voter turnout is the percentage of eligible citizens who actually make it to the polls. And if you look in comparison to other democracies, we're among the lowest for the world's developed democratic nations. In other words, of the advanced industrial democracies, the wealthy democracies, we rank really low. We're just not as involved as we should be. In fact, it shows here two different scales. If you look for presidential years, only about 58% of Americans turn out. And in non-presidential years, let's say what we call midterm elections, like 2014 and 2010, the midterm of a president's, the middle of a president's term, we're at like 37%. And so it's really kind of interesting to see how low we are on that scale. Now, if you look here, this isn't anything new. If you notice, there's a lot of variance in turnout. You see that the red represents presidential years, and it's always higher than non-presidential years. But look, there's a lot of voting going on, and Americans, again, they get tired of voting. Interestingly enough, what you see here is that Americans often vote when there's a presidential election because they feel that more is at stake. And so they vote less when they feel like not as much is at stake. Now, interestingly enough, what you often see is that then special interest groups or groups that are these passionates that we talked about, they have much more influence in in the midterm elections because they're the ones who actually turn out to vote. This may also explain why we see a little bit more polarization, or maybe people are a little bit more extreme, is because they know that every 2 years, if they have to be voted on by these passionates, they got to appeal to these passionates. So the argument can be made that if Americans voted at consistent levels, let's say across the board here, then what that would do is that would help tremendously, instead of voting here, if they all voted at the same level, that might moderate politics. We wouldn't have such extremes like you see. Now, there are other ways to get involved, other electoral activities. There are meetings and there are rallies. People do go to meetings and rallies. Actually, it's kind of a hallmark. It's a very common thing for Americans to do. They post signs, have bumper stickers, and they can also donate money. They give money to candidates or to causes or to political parties themselves. Now, the second type of way that we get involved is what we call civic volunteerism. Civic volunteerism is where you have citizen participation in public life without government incentives or coercion. In other words, you're engaging in public activity that is not politically motivated. This is something maybe like you speaking at a town meeting versus paying taxes. You're not politically motivated per se. You're going because you think it's the right thing to do, or you might be volunteering with AYSO, volunteering at your church, a whole range of volunteer activities that exist. And we do. Americans volunteer for causes at much higher rates than citizens of other democratic countries. And if you'll look, you'll see that the Generation Y, your generation, is the most active in modern U.S. history when it comes to volunteering. And if you look over the past decade, the proportion of teenagers who have volunteered have more than doubled. And in fact, Americans, look at this, aged 15 to 25, self-reporting reasons for volunteering. Why then do people between the ages of 15 and 25 volunteer? For a whole host of reasons. You know, the green saying it makes a difference. Yellow makes me feel good. You know, blue saying issues matter to me. Purple being religious, and 19 being other. And it makes a difference, it makes me feel good, it matters to me. So interestingly enough, while younger Americans, your Generation Y, are not voting at higher levels, in fact, they're voting at lower levels than other generations, they are participating more than other generations, which is really interesting. The key is whether or not that civic volunteerism will translate into political participation, and that's a good question. Many political scientists argue that it will, that civic volunteerism is sort of the entryway to political participation, that eventually you say, well, I've got to do something about politics. But we'll see. We're not quite there yet. The last one is political voice. That's another way that you get involved. Political voice is exercising one's public rights, often through speaking out in protest or in favor of some policy change. You know, it could also involve having opinions about public officials. Now, this type of participation in civic life can be as simple as following the news headlines. And for those of you that are online through social media, talking or blogging or tweeting about politics and policy is a low-level gateway to expressing your political voice. So I really like this cartoon that I put up. I think most people can agree with this. I desperately need a hide political post button on Facebook so I can still like all my friends after the election year is over. You truly start understanding what your friends believe in when they start posting things on Facebook. And we often may agree or disagree with what they're doing. All right, so agitating, such as the civil rights movement, the recent Tea Party protests against Obamacare, environmental protests, these are all part of what we call political voice. And, you know, sometimes it can be difficult to tell the difference between passionate expressions of political voice and illegal activity. For example, most of us that watch this, if you're watching this video, you probably would agree that civil rights is a good thing. It helped bring political power to African Americans in the South, restored the right to vote. Overall, a very promising thing, but it was an illegal activity. It was what we call civil disobedience. Dr. Martin Luther King and others said we're going to break the law not because we're bad people, but because the law is wrong. And so because the law is wrong, then we have a moral duty to not obey this. Well, critics of the civil rights movement often said, okay, you might be doing a good thing, but you're doing it the wrong way. You're breaking the law. So this is illegal. So none of us would say that the illegal activity of the civil rights movement was wrong. We would say that they did the right thing. You know, in retrospect, would say they had to break the law. That was the only way to bring attention to this. But back then, people said, no, this is illegal. This is not the right way to do things. So very interesting. It wasn't just African Americans who said this. It wasn't just whites who said this. There were African American religious leaders as well. One of the reasons why the Black Baptist Convention that was split into two was primarily because one of the major African American Baptist leaders had resisted breaking the law, whereas Dr. Martin Luther King said, no, we need to break the law. Break laws that are considered evil. He would put a moral weight on it. All right, moving on. So what inspires in political participation? Very, very interesting, because it certainly isn't voting. Voting in and of itself, many political scientists kind of say is an irrational act. They call this the paradox of voting. We vote, even though we know our single vote probably is not going to change an election. It's very rare that a single vote changes an election, or that a few votes. It does happen. One time was in 2000 presidential election in Florida, where 537 votes separated candidates George Bush and Al Gore. gave George Bush the presidency. So that's a rare occasion. If it's going to happen, it's going to be more likely at the local level, but that's only because there's so little turnout. For example, there's going to be so little turnout for city council elections in your area that a few hundred votes may make the difference. But yet, Americans do get involved, and we get involved by the tens of millions. So whether we're voting, volunteering, or expressing our political voice, something or someone, or often both, kind of generally helped inspire us to do so. So let's look about this. What inspires us to be involved politically, even though our one vote or our one voice or our one act may not change everything? So let's take a look. Let's look at the spurs to individual participation. 1 second. All right, so what are the spurs for individual participation? The 4 leading influences that serve as spurs to individual participation would be personal background, friends, family, and social capital, political mobilization, and government benefits. So let's talk about this first one, personal background. Your personal background really does matter in terms of why you participate. For example, age is a very strong predictor of political participation. The older you are, the more likely you are going to vote. And we do see this, that older people vote more often. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. And we do see this, that young adults vote less in election after election. Another strong predictor of political participation is wealth. Those who earn more are more likely to participate in politics. So the top earners are very involved in public life. And so now another thing is that the higher their income, the more likely you also are to vote Republican. The lower the income, the more likely you are to vote Democrat. Now, education also predicts political involvement. The more educated you are, the more likely you are going to vote. If you have a college degree, for example, you're more likely to vote than those who do not have a college degree. Now, race and ethnicity is less of a predictor than it used to be. It used to be that whites would vote at much higher rates than every other group. But African Americans have now caught up to whites in terms of their voting rates. Now, Latino and Asian Americans vote at much lower levels, but as time progresses and there are larger chunks of the population are still immigrant that have not yet naturalized or attained citizenship. It's more likely that once they do attain citizenship that they're going to vote, and or the next generation, which will be born here in the United States, is more likely to vote. So let's take a look at some of these graphs sort of to kind of visualize what we're talking about. If you look at voter turnout in the presidential election over the past 12 years by age in the United States, you see that those that are 65 plus vote at 70% and above. They vote at very high rates. Look at 18 to 19-year-old, 18 to 29-year-old, and you see that they vote at much lower. It's almost 30% less than those that are older. And you see that there are differences by ages. So we can see here visually, we can see through descriptive statistics that definitely the older you are, the more likely to predict that you're going to vote. Next, if you see here, we talked about if you're wealthier, you're more likely to vote Republican. And look at this here. Republican voter share among the U.S. wealthy, that regardless of the election, 2004, 8, 2012, notice that you see a trend that if you are over 100,000, it's almost guaranteed for you to, if you're over 100,000, it's like a 60% probability that you're going to vote Republican. Now, why is this? Generally speaking, the Republicans tend to be in favor of cutting taxes, usually cutting taxes for people in that tax bracket. Generally, the belief by Republicans is that if you cut taxes for certain people at the top, then they'll take that money and reinvest it into the United States economy, thereby generating more jobs. It sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. It really depends on the economy at the time. Cutting taxes doesn't always spur job growth. Cutting taxes actually might do the opposite. Or it depends on whether or not the U.S. economy is strong. If the U.S. economy is strong, then the wealthy may reinvest. If not, they may reinvest outside of the United States. So it's not as consistent as it was. Definitely that was the case maybe under Reagan in 1981 when wealthy Americans had less places to spend their money. But today, you don't have to spend your money in the U.S. And this is starting to change a little bit. Now, you do see, though, that wealthy Americans still overwhelmingly vote Republican, and that's primarily because Republicans still say we're going to cut taxes for those at the top to spur investment. Whether or not that works is really, economists struggle mightily on whether or not it works or does not work. It's more philosophical at that point than evidentially based. All right. Next, you see here, youth voter turnout in presidential elections by educational attainment. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually control for age, right? We're going to say between the ages of 18 and 29. But look, we're going to show the differences by education. And if you look at those who are young and have a bachelor's degree or more, look at that percent turnout rate. It's like 80%. Look at this. From 1972 all the way to 2008, it's really consistent. And then you notice that for those who have less than a high school diploma, it's like around 20 to 30%. It's very low. So if you see here, what you'll notice is that education can really ameliorate age. It can ameliorate income. The more educated you are, the more aware you are of the issues, the more you feel that you matter. We call this actually efficacy. This is something the authors don't talk about, but we call it political efficacy. It's that you feel like you have that what you're doing matters, and so that you're willing to get involved in politics through voting or through other type of activities. And then finally, the next one you'll see here. Oops, excuse me. Let me go back a slide. Is let's see, I went too far. Is voter turnout. There we go. Voter turnout by ethnicity. You'll see here that in 2008 and 2012, African Americans caught up to whites and then surpassed whites. This is directly attributable to the campaign by the first African American candidate, Barack Obama. It dramatically it led to an increase in a turnout by African Americans. But you also see that there's been there was a drop in turnout by whites in 2008 and 2012. Some argue that is also directly attributable to Barack Obama. Some scholars have argued that some whites were unable to vote for Barack Obama. Maybe some Southern Democrats that for the longest time had voted Democrat but couldn't vote for an African American candidate. Studies show that the white vote in West Virginia dropped by 15% in the 2008 election, and it had been consistent for 100 and something years before that. So race definitely plays a role in turnout. You can see it here. You see that Latinos and Asian Americans have increased their turnout, but it's nowhere near the levels of African Americans and whites. All right, so what's the next spur for participation? What we call friends, family, and social capital. On average, someone whose family or friends vote regularly is often more likely to do so as well, because you're talking politics, you're introducing them. You know, for example, I was watching, a while ago some presidential debates, and my son, who was young, said, "Dad, what are you watching?" I said, "I'm watching the debates," and he wanted me to explain it to him. Because I was watching the debates and I was talking about politics, he was also interested. So that's not a surprise then, right? That if you have friends or family who are interested in politics or vote on a regular basis, they're more likely to do so as well. And that's probably a really strong predictor on why you may vote or be involved or care about politics. Probably an even more powerful inspiration is being asked to vote or volunteer or otherwise exercise political voice by people close to you. This often happens in the classes that I teach. I'll often tell people, you should vote, and here's why you should vote. And many times when you're asked to vote, you feel like it's almost like your duty to vote. You get this sense of civic duty or civic pride. The next one is higher social capital. You see that, depending on your type of community, it could also seem to make a difference. For example, in areas where neighbors are more trusting, you often see a general norm where people are more likely to get involved. So the more connected you are, the more trust you have, the more likely you are to vote. So this is why you might see very tight congregations or very tight civic associations or business trade associations. They vote because they know that it's the right thing to do for their small community, for their small group of people. And so it's very interesting to see that, this connection really matters. Again, family and friends are probably the biggest thing. We often maybe say you inherit this tendency towards political participation. that, you know, you see this from your friends and family, it's just something that you do, you know. And the opposite is true. If your parents aren't involved, your friends aren't involved, nobody cares for politics, then if you do care for politics, you're an outlier. You're somebody, you know, that's unlikely for you to be involved. All right. The next thing then is political mobilization. This is probably the next major factor on why people vote or get involved. Literally what happened is there are efforts by folks to encourage you to engage in politics. Now, historically, this has been done by political parties. They often reach out to you through campaign mailers or through TV commercials or through radio spots, or even now there was one state assembly person who came to my class and lectured. He now does it through Pandora Radio, and they can actually kind of target specific groups. It was very interesting how he did this. But he's also the CEO of a major gaming software company, the former mayor of Big Bear. And so he was able to, he understands how to use technology in order to reach out to people. Most of the advocacy work now and reaching out and trying to mobilize is actually done by professional organizations, interest groups. A lot of this is now interest groups. You really see that in the eyes of professional political mobilizers, advocacy groups, campaign strategies, and other members now form this large, what we call political industry based in Washington, D.C. And each of us is now a potential resource for these folks. So I have a picture here of what's called CPAC. It's a Conservative Political Action Committee that's sponsored by the American Conservative Union. That is an interest group that pushes conservative causes or conservative issues. They hold a conference every year, and people who are looking to become the Republican nominee for president often attend these CPAC meetings to get their voice heard, introduced to them. This is an interest group. Now, this interest group, if you're a conservative, you think it's great. If you're a liberal, you don't think it's great at all. This is what you think is wrong with interest groups. So I'm careful with criticizing interest groups because it really is, as you can see in the eye of the beholder here, depending on if your interest group serves your interest, they're a good interest group. If they don't serve your interest, then they're one of those bad interest groups. So keep in mind when we're critical of interest groups. But now CPAC is the one who's going to be doing the reaching out. CPAC's going to be sending the mailers and calling people. It used to be that parties did this, and they still do to some extent, but now more and more of it is through this new political industry, reaching out to people, getting them to vote. And if you see here, it does matter. Let me tell you why. If you look at this one right here, this graph, this bar chart right here, this is the ideological composition of Americans. This is, you know, the yellow here saying consistently liberal, 22% somewhat liberal, 39% are mixed, 18% are somewhat conservative, 9% are consistently conservative. But if you look here, you know, liberals are a larger, consistently liberal Americans are a larger percentage of those who vote in the general election, and they're even larger percentage of those who vote in the primaries right here, if you see this. Same holds true for conservatives. A larger proportion of consistently conservative Americans vote in the general election, while a larger proportion vote in the primaries, as you can see right here. So it matters then that these interest groups reach out to people who are consistently liberal, consistently conservative. And if you look at those who contacted officials, donated money, attended events, and volunteers, you know, liberals, consistently liberal Americans, and consistently liberal or consistently conservative Americans, they outnumber those that are somewhat or mixed. And so they have an outsized influence in the process. This can explain why maybe we've become more polarized. In other words, we see that Republicans and Democrats are less likely to work with each other, are more willing to combat each other. We often talk that politics is the art of compromise. Politics is the art of deal-making. Well, if you're seen as compromising too much, then you're going to be out of touch with these folks here on these extreme edges, because they're the ones who are going to be most likely to donate, attend, volunteer, contact, more likely to vote consistently. And so it's a real mixed bag. It's really difficult if you're trying to be a moderate, because moderates, they just don't vote at the same levels as others do. All right, so let's move on. The next factor in explaining participation would be that of government beneficiaries. This is those who receive government benefits are more likely to participate, and this is especially true later in life. There's probably some conflation here with age. Those who receive Social Security benefits and those who receive, Medicare are generally older. Though if you are on disability, you do receive Social Security, but the numbers are much smaller. So yeah, if you receive government benefits, you're more likely to participate. And then also too, when government rewards service recipients, they're also more likely to volunteer. So for example, returning soldiers from deployments or those who have been active duty, maybe not deployed but still been active duty, they're much more likely to participate because they receive benefits after their service has been completed, for example, like the GI Bill or veteran health benefits. So they're much more involved because they want to make sure that their benefits continue. I had a former student from Victor Valley College, I won't mention his name, you probably wouldn't care if I did, but he actually wrote to his congressman to make sure that the GI Bill, the 9/11, post-9/11 GI Bill would apply to certain universities. They were thinking about cutting them to certain universities, and he fought successfully. In fact, he was able to get Paul Cook, the representative for the High Desert region, and 20 other Congress people to sponsor a bill, and then it was part of a larger bill and then signed by President Barack Obama. So this one student affected change across the country simply because he was adamant that his benefits would not run out. After serving in Iraq for 3 deployments, he felt that it was his right to have these benefits, and he fought tooth and nail, and he was able to enlist the aid of a lot of other veterans to make sure that their benefits were not cut when it came to applying to certain institutions. You can email me later if you want it, and I can send you the work that this student did. It mainly had to deal with private universities, more like a Columbia or a Yale or a Harvard. They were looking to cut funding for veterans to those places, basically put a cap on funding, and that's not what they were told when they would come in. So I won't keep too long on this lecture, but you can email me if you're interested. I can send you the stuff if you could see how that actually looks like. But there's a reason. This student and others, they got involved because they wanted to make sure that their benefits that they're receiving for the service that they rendered was continued. All right. Now, what discourages in political participation? There's probably 4 broad reasons why people do not participate in political life. The first is probably that of alienation. Alienation from public life can be described as a feeling of powerlessness or inability to control one's own political fate. If I can use that word efficacy again, is that they feel like they have no efficacy, no political efficacy. They believe that their actions just don't matter, that no matter what they do really is unimportant. And so, not having parents or peers that are actively engaged probably makes one less likely to feel like they actually can, affect change. And too many politicians, sometimes if there's too many elections, we talked about that, voter fatigue, or too much advertising. In fact, a lot of the advertising since 1987, 88 on has been much more negative. And so this negative advertising that you see can really sort of drive Americans to feel alienated, that that they're not a part of politics. A second major area on why Americans traditionally have not been part of politics is that of institutional barriers. And there were formal institutional barriers historically under segregation. This was often known as the Jim Crow system in the South, where post-Civil War, African Americans were given the right to vote. And then many Southern whites instituted programs to try and limit that right to vote, or essentially disenfranchise, take it away. Literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, white primaries, all of these were sort of used as a way to try and discourage or prevent newly freed slaves and their descendants from being able to vote. In fact, it was very effective. It took all the way up into the 1950s and 60s with the Civil Rights Movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King and the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 by President Lyndon Johnson to overcome all of these barriers. And as you can see from a previous slide, African American political participation has skyrocketed since then. Now, what are the institutional barriers today? Sometimes it's just difficult to sign up. If you move from one state to another, it's difficult. If you're young, it's not automatic. In most countries, registration is automatic. You turn 18, you get your little voter registration card, no ifs, ands, or buts. In this country, registration is voluntary, which means you need to actually, every state has the right to determine and almost all, I think almost all states except for Oregon say it's your responsibility to register. Oregon has an automatic registration, and California is thinking of moving towards an automatic registration, that when you get your driver's license, it's provisional until you're 18. Then when you get your official driver's license, you also are registered to vote. You would pick which party or which affiliation. They haven't decided that yet, but that's something that they've been talking about. Now, another institutional barrier is the disenfranchisement of individuals convicted of a crime. And what you see is that you can be barred from voting depending on if you've committed a felonious crime and have been convicted and sent to jail. It varies by state. In some states you lose your right to vote permanently. Other states it's given back to you when you've served time. Others you have to reapply. So it varies by state, but that's another barrier. Another barrier is difficulty in accessing information about particular subjects. So if you're voting, let's say, in a proposition or voting on an initiative and you're not quite sure sort of what's going on, you're not sure that you want to vote, so you just choose not to vote. Language barriers, especially true in places like Southern California. We have a high number of naturalized immigrants or immigrants that have become citizens, but they may not understand what's actually being written. So in any district, now any electoral district, where there's more than 5% of a language minority, the ballots have to be printed in that language. But yet still sometimes there may not be 5%, so you're stuck without a ballot in your language. And finally, identification requirements in some states. This is much more controversial. Many conservative states have pushed through laws basically saying that you have to show identification, otherwise you can't vote. And so many Democrats often argue that this disenfranchises and puts a barrier up to poor Americans because your number one form of identification is your driver's license. And if you don't drive, then you don't tend to have a license or an ID. So many poor Americans who use public transportation may not get a ID feeling that they don't need one, or they may not be able to afford it, is what Democrats tend to say. Republicans say nonsense, it's to keep fraud from occurring, and that way people aren't cheating when it comes to voting. But the studies show that there is very, very little fraud. There is very little. In fact, you're talking out of, a million votes cast, 5,000. You know what I mean? That you're talking about very small numbers of actual fraud being committed, not enough to turn elections historically. So, I think that generally speaking here, Democrats are saying that it's Republicans trying to keep certain minority groups and the elderly from voting who would probably otherwise vote Democrat. And there's a lot of evidence to kind of support that. The evidence is not there to say that there is mass fraud in voting. It's just not there. You don't see the evidence of this here. So that's very controversial, and that's been a bigger political controversy lately. So what do these institutional barriers look like? If you look on the right, that's an actual scan of a poll tax receipt. So somebody who paid $1.50 so they could vote back in the 1880s. And then on the right is a copy from the ACLU.org of a supposed literacy test that existed in the state of Louisiana. Now I say supposed because this was a literacy test that was shown to be included in several different parishes in Louisiana, but no one can actually find the original. These are copies of the original. And so because it's copies of the original, most agree that this literacy test existed, but they can't say with certainty that it did. Now there's another literacy test by Alabama. They have the original copies, and this was the literacy test that was throughout the state of Alabama. And that one definitely, those are the questions that you see in your book. That ask, about, for example, the electoral vote for president is counted in the presence of two governmental bodies. The president is forbidden to exercise his authority in the pardon of the cases of. And so those actually come from a original test, literacy test that you can find out. What were these literacy tests designed to do? That if you didn't score a perfect or you didn't get, like 19 out of 20, that you were not able to vote. And so obviously what would happen is somebody would be manning the table, an African American in the South would come up and ask for the test, and even if they scored 19 out of 20 or 20 out of 20, which was nearly impossible, the committee would then meet and say, sorry, you can't vote. So this is a way to disenfranchise African Americans from voting. And then if somebody who was white who came up and said didn't score as well, the committee would go back and say, you know what, that's okay, you can vote. Now, again, mostly used to disenfranchise African Americans in the South, sometimes used to disenfranchise poor whites. Wealthy whites often worried in the South that poor whites and African Americans would figure out that they're pretty much in the same boat, and they didn't want that happening either. So depending on the situation, they would also use literature just to keep poor people in general from voting. And since African Americans were overwhelmingly poor at that time, it basically excluded African Americans. But keep in mind that yes, it did exclude some whites, but it was mostly meant to keep African Americans from being able to participate in voting. As I mentioned before, voting is power. And so by keeping people to vote, you essentially keep them from having certain types of powers. All right. So what are some other things that can discourage political participation? Is simply that of complacency. You know, if people are what we say fat and happy, they just don't participate. And there might be some, you know, some evidence for this, that people are just contented. You know, people that are upper middle class, maybe they just don't participate because they don't care that they have to. We call this the culture of contentment. John Kenneth Galbraith, you know, who was a famous economist, he says that the upper middle class and the top of the wealth distribution fight to sustain their contented way of life, and what it does, it discourages less well-off people from participating. So kind of this cartoon I have here is, here's democracy's strength as the ballot box, but you know, it's easily nullified if nobody uses it. So just kind of idea that people who are satisfied may not participate, and that people who are satisfied may want to keep others who are not satisfied from participating. So it can kind of cut both ways in this. And then finally, we're looking at shifting mobilization patterns. Prior to the 1960s, political parties were the main source of political mobilization. Since the 1960s, you've seen what we call advocacy group organizing. In other words, advocacy groups now focus on specific causes. And, you know, what's happened is these changes tend to benefit those who are well off or those who have time and money and be able to devote to public involvement, and it involves less people who are just the working class. This has led to dwindling opportunities then for the uneducated and the poor, and sort of led to what we call now a circle of non-participation, where you have resistance by political parties to mobilize disengaged Americans to vote because their lack of involvement makes their allegiance to one or another party suspect. In other words, if you're not a registered voter and you don't show that you're voting, in fact, your voting record is public, people can go and see how you voted. In fact, people pay money to get these voter records so then they can start micro-targeting. What they do is start targeting those. And so what they do is they often call the rich get richer. They're going to go after people who vote. This is what interest groups and political parties are going to do. So I'm a voter. I vote all the time. So I'm constantly getting bombarded with flyers and messages and emails and what have not because I vote. I matter. Whereas somebody who does vote, in this case it might be you watching this video, if you're not a voter, then you may not get targeted at all. In other words, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. You're not going to get mobilized. Now, honestly, they don't need to mobilize me. I'm going to vote anyways because I understand the importance of it. Now they're just trying to get my vote. But they're not willing to spend the money on mobilizing someone like you if you're one of these people who are in this, who do not participate. So it almost forms this circle of non-participation. You don't want to participate, and therefore they don't want to spend the money to mobilize you to participate, which makes you even more alienated and not participate. And then it's kind of this vicious circle, and it's really not good for democracy at all. When people feel like they're being ignored, then there's feelings of alienation come in, and then you're unlikely to participate at all. You just feel like it doesn't matter what you do, man. They're all the same. There's no real, difference. You hear this all the time from people. Those are people who definitely don't feel like they're involved, who do not feel like they have any real, that it doesn't matter. You hear these same things over and over again from people. It doesn't matter what I say or what I do. There are circles, of this, so just to get an idea. All right. So the next thing the authors do, they look at this generationally. They look at your generation Y in political participation, and they notice that younger Americans have lower rates, as we mentioned, of political participation than do older age groups. However, they are more likely to volunteer for organizations that serve the public. And the reason why this might exist is because volunteerism is an individual activity, whereas voting is communal. And what I mean by this is that you might actually get more out of it when you volunteer for like picking trash up on the beach, or volunteering with your church, or volunteering for AYSO, you've decided to volunteer and you see the immediate benefit. Whereas voting is more communal, excuse me. You don't see the immediate benefit. And because you don't see the immediate benefit, you're like, well, then why am I doing this? And you want some immediate gratification or personal satisfaction out of it. And so this is why you see that new forms of civic volunteerism have surged in participation among college students and recent graduates. In fact, now what you see is what we call alternative spring breaks, where instead of going and partying on a spring break at a college or university, now what they do is actually go do humanitarian. They may do Habitat for Humanity, build homes, do something with their church or youth group. You see a lot of this. All right. If you see here in terms of statistics, there are opportunities, there's demand for participation by generation. So the yellow is have a place to go and discuss issues affecting the community, and blue would get more involved with them, more opportunities. And you see that, you know, definitely, you know, millennials are would be much more involved if there were opportunities in comparison to Gen Xers, baby boomers, and those who are in the World War II or greatest generation. Less likely to say that they need a place to go to discuss issues affecting the community. Obviously, they're more wired. They're more wired and more connected into, you know, socially through the internet. Then they don't need a place to go. Their phone is their place to go. That's not the case, obviously, with older generations, as we understand why. All right, so that's actually kind of a good segue, because now we talk about the internet, social media, and participation, because social media has changed the way we participate politically. And Facebook has really heralded a revolution in participation. I don't think we're underestimating when we talk about how Facebook, for example, led directly to the Arab Spring of 2011 in Egypt, where an authoritarian president, Hosni Mubarak, had been overthrown after 29 and a half years in power. Was mostly through the efforts of student activist groups on Facebook. Facebook has become a powerful tool for people to organize and get together. The next thing has become Voice over Internet Protocol. One of the major programs that uses the Voice over Internet Protocol is Skype. And Skype and GoToMeeting and other of these face-to-face connections have really connected people across the globe. I mean, I talk to my family overseas all the time through Skype, something that I didn't have, you know, 10 years ago. Nowadays, a huge range of live government hearings and documents are available online. In fact, you can go to the Board of Trustees meeting for your particular college or university, and you can see sort of the meetings that take place. And it's possible, as I mentioned, to mobilize tens of thousands of members or followers by text or by tweet or through Twitter. You can see actually that protest crowds will dissipate and form based on text messages. They will be texting each other. Hey, the police are coming, leave this area. Or hey, you know what? They coordinate and organize this way. Now, an emerging social sector will stand alongside the private and public sectors as a space for widespread involvement. And so, you know, the social sector often used to be that we would, you know, go to bowling leagues or AYSO, go to church or Toastmasters. Now you're seeing an emerging social sector that it has to do with the internet. And so there's an internet social sector that's developing, a digital social sector. And we should understand sort of the effect that this may have on politics, because some are arguing that technology will reboot democracy. Here's the arguments that are made. The arguments that are made is that if you look at people who use the internet, internet users are very active. They're the ones who are posting stuff. They're the ones who are talking about things on Facebook. You know, whether you like that or not, you know, sometimes we don't like that, but they're the ones who are the ones who are doing this. Internet users can easily respond to an issue much faster than, let's say, writing a letter to a congressman, or picking up your phone and calling your congressman, or calling in to, let's say, like a conservative talk show. You know, it's much easier just to, you know, post something in your blog, respond to a blog post, you know, put a comment now most of your comments are moderated, but put a comment after an article. You know, I don't know how many of you will sit there and read a news article and look at the comments below and go, wow, you know, and see what people say. The internet expands the range of commentary. You know, what we mean by this is that the internet is, you know, it's many more people can participate and comment than they couldn't before. And the internet also offers for politicians and parties to reach out. Politicians and parties are savvy. They have Facebook pages. They have Twitter accounts. You know, depending on what a politician may say, it may boost his or her, you know, Twitter followers. You know, and you're talking about bypassing the media. With a Twitter account, you know, you're going directly to the people who have signed up for your account. It's not being filtered by NBC, ABC, or CBS. Facebook is the same way. If you're following on Facebook, you can get a direct account or direct message from your politician. And so this is, you know, circumventing traditional media. Before traditional, you know, politicians had to go to traditional media. Then traditional media would kind of filter and then kind of maybe put a spin on what the politician said. Here it is. It's the direct connection. So some would argue that here it goes. We're making a better connection using social media. And the internet's finally overcoming what we call the digital divide. You know, there's an argument made that, you know, that America still has a digital divide. Those that are with or without internet access. About 2/3 of American adults have reliable online access, but 1/3 are unable to access this tool for public engagement. Now, according to a 2013 study of regular internet users, nearly 27% are not on Facebook, Twitter, or some similar service. And those that are not participating in social network sites tend to have less education and lower incomes. They are also older as well. So 56% of 50 to 64-year-old Americans do not use a social networking site. Now, not everyone agrees. Some are kind of skeptical. Oh, forgive me, before I get into that, let's look at a view of online social activity by race and ethnicity. And what you see that social networking, you see, is very high with the Latinos and with African Americans, a little bit less with whites. That's mainly reflected in younger generations. Most of your older generation is white, so it makes sense that if the more of your older generation is white, whereas most of your younger generation are Latino, Asian, and African American. You see here tweeting, African Americans tweet at a much higher rate than whites and Latinos, and African Americans blog at higher rates than whites and Latinos. Now, not everyone agrees that, you know, technology will reboot democracy. You know, some are arguing that there might be more hype and danger than democratic renaissance. One of the things he argues simply is that sustained power over central control can actually harm the internet. You know, internet tools, they argue, could easily be subject to control and disruption by central governments. That central governments like China can block social media sites. They can put what they call the Great Wall of China, you know, in terms of the firewall. You know, they can keep certain media content from coming in. And so, you know, the internet, nobody governs the internet. The internet is actually governed through internet service providers, and internet service providers are under a lot of pressure through regulatory authorities to not allow for certain content. And so, or to work with certain, with the authorities on certain content. Now, you might sit here and say, oh, that's not a good thing. We should let anything go on the internet, anything be free. But even the U.S. has passed an act saying that if there is, you know, let's say, for example, acts of child pornography on the internet, that the internet service providers work with law enforcement authorities to go after these folks who post this stuff. And so almost, I don't know anybody who would disagree, but all of us would agree that that's a really good thing that they're doing this. So sometimes the central control can be good. Other times the central control can be to benefit a particular government's interest in what they want to see done. Another sort of hype is that the internet may not elevate new voices. That's the problem with the internet. Anybody can write something, but it doesn't mean anybody's reading it. So, you know, there could be millions and millions of web pages written by folks, but doesn't mean anybody's actually reading what you're writing. So it's very interesting. So the internet might be democratizing, but may not necessarily mean that more people care what you're saying. Also, there's what we call there's so much out there. The volume and variety of available information is mind-boggling. We often refer to this as the din. The sheer volume of information, 250 million websites on the internet. It's just too much information. It's information overload, and often you don't want anything to do with it because it's just too much. And finally, the web can incubate lies, malice, and falsehood. A lot of your conspiracy theories are on the internet. people really spend a lot of time pushing forward internet conspiracy theories. The ones that are really funny to me are when they look at pictures from the Mars rover and the Mars Explorer, and they look like a human or look like a couch or they look like something, and it's just the shade or shot or the shape or the size. It's not anything other than just the way the picture was taken, yet people read into these pictures from Mars as much as they want. If you happen to be one of those folks, and you're one of these folks who are using the web as a way to try to promote a conspiracy. Here's what it is. There's actually people on Mars with couches. All right. Now, finally, we talk about behavior and political power institution. Americans engage in destructive behavior all the time. We often injure ourselves and others around us. So, given that, how should society respond? It's very interesting because the best way to do this, to keep ourselves from engaging in destructive behavior like smoking or driving too fast or assault, is to simply put government restrictions. So let's put government restrictions. Let's restrict people from doing certain things. And what that will do is that will help, protect people. Help from injure ourselves and injure those around us. But we tend to resist government restrictions. We often say it's my right, if I want to smoke, it's my right to kill myself. Okay, I've heard students say that, but then what about the secondhand smoke of those around? They don't think of that. And so, there's this clash then between individual liberties and what we call the greater good. And so the authors have made an argument here, and I'm not too sure about this argument. It's kind of interesting. This is the first time I've actually read this, and I read in political science quite a bit. This idea of what we call a nudgeocracy. And so this is the idea that people can be nudged by government rather than ordered or coerced or required to act in certain ways. That would be including to participate politically. And so, what happens in this case is government is encouraging the right kind of participation in a kind of what we call libertarian paternalism. Or that's a very negative way. Maybe it's another type of central government control, where others are saying, no, this is just trying to, really sort of try to nudge people to do the right thing. So instead of rules and regulations, you frame options differently so that the right choice is most likely the choice for most people. So how does this look like then? The first way of understanding this is what we call the bandwagon effect. This is the general tendency of many people to take up a practice or join a cause because other people are doing it. For example, ever since California Governor Jerry Brown announced that we're in an extreme drought, people have been ripping up their lawns. And now it's almost become sort of like a contest. Everyone is now ripping up their lawns, or I should say most everyone. I think there's some folks in the high desert who are not going to rip up their lawns no matter what, even though they live in a desert. Think about that. But they're ripping up their lawns and they're putting in xeriscaping or rocks or cacti or some kind of formation. And it's almost like, hey, now we're all on the bandwagon. We're all on this, effort to remove our lawns, since lawns are a major reason why we use water, and that water could be put to better use, they argue. Second thing that we do is anchoring. Anchoring is a much more it's not as an active thing. What happens with anchoring is it's a behavioral bias that leads many people to rely too much on a single piece of information, like often a number, that allows us to then understand something. So we humans are prone to this. Our personal experience, even when it's completely irrelevant to the question at hand, will color our judgment. And so, you'll see this, what it says, for example, the argument that they use is talking about, in places like cities like New York or Philadelphia, where they now put caloric labeling on menus in recent years. So, for example, when you go to California, you'll actually see that they have the calories underneath each sandwich, sort of telling you how much calories you're getting. And many nutrition experts and city health officials widely expected then that people would reduce the caloric intake once they knew how many calories they were consuming. In fact, what they noticed that customers actually ate slightly more calories than before. So they essentially refused to participate in the healthier choices that public officials had devised for them. And what could maybe explain this is simply that of anchoring. Without a clear sense of how many calories they should eat, many consumers tended to feel a sense of false mastery. So in other words, they weren't really understanding how many calories they were getting because they were so prone to just eating what they wanted. So because they were eating what they wanted, they made a false correlation between, oh, okay, I'm eating this many calories and eating what I wanted. In other words, they just fell back into their own habits. This is our personal experience, our habits. They're really hard to break. We anchor ourselves in these habits, and they are difficult to break out of. They can be completely irrelevant or even at what's going on, but these are our habits. This is what we know. The last one is the default option. The default option is where people choose the simplest option, so they make the right choice, the first and the easiest option, with bad choices being the one that require effort to make. In other words, Occam's razor, the simplest answer is often the best answer. Well, it may not be actually. It may be that the simplest answer is simply just the simplest answer. It's just we don't want to actually do any work to get this done, so we just pick the default option, the one that's the easiest for us. Now, all of these nudges, could be harnessed to enhance political participation. If everyone is perceived as participating, most of us are likely to do so as well, which confirms kind of the bandwagon effect. And both the default and the anchoring behavior can also be employed also to enhance public engagement as well. So, conclusion, looking at political participation in a digital age, this chapter kind of chronicles a 21st century trend of lower political participation among Americans. One answer to the how to encourage participation question requires us to look at history and sort of see how participation is looked at in the past to make us understand how it looks like now. Mass engagement in politics and other civic activities is kind of the lifeblood of American democracy. And it helps explain why analysts like myself were so anxious to expand participation, thinking that this is the best cure for what's ailing our democracy, just to get people more involved. And we see that such involvement has clear personal benefits. If you are involved, you often tend to have better grades if you're a student, better career opportunities because you have more connections, increased and more manageable social networks, and you even tend to be healthier and happier. People who are engaged and less alienated, people who feel connections, feel like they're part of a community, they're just overall have a higher standard of living. And so this concludes the lecture for Chapter 7, Political Participation, in Maroney and Kirsch's book, By the People Debating American Democracy.